So first week, we went over some of the cosmological components of yoga as it pertains to the Samkhya philosophy. Week 1, week 2, we went into what was that? Which we covered a little bit in our first class together.
Is it the 8 limbs?
Really good, Crystal. Be a little bit more specific. What about the 8-limb system that we cover? And by the 8 limbs, we're referring to Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. So we went over the second goal of yoga, which is the operation of stilling the movement of mind, which relates to what? The vrittis, thought, the movement of thought. And we are essentially nirodha-ing the mind, which is stilling. We're nirodha-ing the mind from the vrittis, the movement of thought, which is not the erasing of thought, it's the one-pointed focus of thought. Thinking is a really important component of the sutras, but not in the way that we conceptualize thinking. Okay? Celeste, Crystal, you with me? Robert, you with me? 3 various students. Okay? Everybody else, look forward to reading your responses in the coming weeks. Okay, so what did we cover in the first 2 weeks? We talked about this idea of the Purusha, which is this universal essential quality that's unmanifest. Universal essential force, vital force that's unmanifest. So what does it mean to be unmanifest, or for something to be unmanifest? That it hasn't literally materialized. It hasn't undergone what I refer to as an individuation process. Individuation, over here on the left-hand side, you probably cannot see that, nor could you probably read that because my writing is so messy. Okay, individuation, the movement from unmanifest, Purusha, toward manifest, which relates to what? Within our cosmological dualistic picture of the Samkhya Yoga Sutras tradition. Prakriti, very good. So here is where things get really interesting, right? Yoga essentially for us is a dualistic, it's not monotheistic, it's dualistic to Purusha, unmanifest, vital force, Prakriti, manifest. Purusha has undergone an individuation process, which results in different physical or material things within our reality. Okay? Now, within that process, within that individuation process, there are different stages of mind. There's the buddhi, there's the ahamkara, the I, and there's the manas, the mind. Okay? So essentially, with the Yoga Sutras, we are undergoing this process. And here, so if you look at the diagram, can you see this, Celeste? Yeah? Thumbs up? Okay. So if you see at this, I'm going to call this the little apex. This line. And what we're going to suggest here is that this is the physical body. That's a stick figure. That's a physical body. To arrive at a physical body, a multicellular organism, certain things are participating in this multiplicit individuation process. So not only is there a trajectory through the buddhi, the ahamkara, the I, and the manas, the mind, but there is this trajectory from the vital force prakriti that includes the 5 elements, okay? The 5 elements. So the 5 elements: space, wind, fire, water, earth. Everything that is prakriti is made up of the 5 elements in a different relationship. Okay? Additionally, within the 5 elements that are representative of different forms of the prakriti is this manifestation of the senses, the tan mutas, okay? The senses: sound, touch, form, taste, and smell, which are also representative of the mahabhutas, the 5 elements, okay? So we have a mixture of both the elements and the sense apparatus of sound, touch, form, taste, and smell that manifests here at the human organism or any other animal or any other form of life, okay? Everything that's prakriti moves through this process, the buddhi, the ahamkara, the manas. So essentially in the yoga tradition, everything contains these 3 components. Even if they're, even if, let's say, for lack of a better word, things are not conscious in and of themselves. Everything contains that. So everything in nature contains this movement or this individuation process. It just manifests in a different way. Similarly, everything contains through this process this unwinding of prakriti through the 5 elements. Okay? So this is where things start to get really interesting. There is this dualistic movement between unmanifest and manifest. Of unmanifest essentially trying to manifest itself in space and time through the mahabhutas and the tanmutras. Am I making sense to everybody? So we good? Yeah. Am I making sense, Celeste, Crystal?
Yes.
Okay, good. Remember, unmute yourself. Not making any sense. There is this opposing movement of unmanifest to manifest, but here's what I'm going to suggest for today. If you look at this diagram of like a cone, right, where everything is funneling in to the manifestation of the physical organism that right now we're going to look at as the human organism, which is manifesting through the 5 senses, through the 5 senses and the 5 elements, all included in the individuation process of the human organism, okay? But equally, as the Purusha, the unmanifest, is manifesting in the physical body, what does the Yoga Sutras suggest that we might be doing within this process? I'll explain the inverted cone soon. 2 funnels. So if our task is to narodaha the mind, the movement of the mind, the vrittis, a sense of stillness, which is manifesting through the 5 elements and the 5 senses. Essentially what we're doing I'm suggesting this, I'm taking some liberties and making this, let's say, as in theoretically interpreting the sutras, okay? That this is an inverted process. As the Purusha attempts to manifest through different physical organisms, our essential goal is the opposite. Is to, from this manifestation of the Purusha, is to again unmanifest through the movement of the stilling of the movement of the mind. So essentially, what we exercise in the physical body through Prakriti is to realize what's already there in the manifestation of what's unmanifest, which is the Purusha.
I mean, the seer.
Yeah, so it's an inverted mirror, this line, right? Whereby the practitioner, if we choose to embark upon the methodology of the sutras, essentially what we're doing is looking, observing what's already there, which is the unmanifest Purusha, because Purusha is contained in all Prakriti. Okay? So it's an inverted cone, right? These things take place on the same plane of time and space. Okay? Purusha is outside of the bounds of all these senses and elements, but it's the thing that manifests these elements. And so if we choose to embark upon the methodology of the sutras, essentially we're turning our gaze back on the Purusha, which is already present in everything that the physical body is doing. Make sense?
Let's say subconscious and conscious as well, or
You could say that. You could say that. I'm going to suggest not to use that type of vocabulary because of its other connotations. The Yoga Sutras is not operating within the space of what's conscious and unconscious, because Purusha is immanent to all Prakriti. Immanent meaning it's contained within all Prakriti. So the task, the methodology that we're learning about, practicing, and maybe at some point down the road, if you choose, teaching to this tradition, is to try to communicate this process, which essentially is uncommunicable. So what are we left with? How do we communicate something like this? Because remember, this is not a philosophical text, it's a methodology. Patanjali has written this with the notion of somebody already being familiar with the philosophical apparatus. He's creating a methodology, a system of, we might say, realization, but basically what I'm referring to as an individuation process whereby the Purusha, the vital force, is realized within Prakriti. So let's now take a step back from that, and now let's conceptualize. So when we consider the 8-limb system, what exactly are we doing? So what are the 8 limbs? Is this interesting? Too much?
no, that's really good.
Crystal, you with me? Okay, what are the 8 limbs?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, everyone call them out to me. What's the first limb? Celeste, I know that you know this.
The yamas.
What's the second limb? Starts with an N. So the yamas and the niyamas are ethical constituents of the practice, okay? How does one conduct themselves in life? What's the third limb? Asana. What is asana? Asana means seat. We'll return to that. Asana, posture, yeah. But primarily we translate it as seat. What's the third? I get a failing grade today. I get a failing grade. Why? My students are not reciting the 8 limbs to me. It's a failing grade for me as a teacher.
You guys have to breathe, right?
Fourth limb is pranayama. Pranayama, breathing. Okay, and then we're not gonna get to the other limbs, but the other limbs are basically the withdrawing of the senses. Sound, touch, form, taste, and smell. So already we get this idea, right? We get this idea of the first 4 limbs are deeply rooted in the 5 elements and within the sensory apparatus of the body. Okay? They're all firmly associated to what's happening physically. Oh, okay, with me? Whereas the other 4 limbs are the movement away from what's taking place as manifest and is drawing attention to what's unmanifest, right? What is samadhi essentially? It's the realization of what's unmanifest. Okay, it doesn't mean disappearing. It just means the focus is so attentive that it becomes dissolved and unmanifest. So we abide in our own nature. What is our own nature? Prakriti, that is the manifestation of Purusha. Essentially, we're abiding in a vital force that undergoes an individuation process that we call Prakriti, that is manifest of the 5 senses, that we associate and experience through the 5 senses. So we have undergone through this individuation process. The methodology of the sutras is an inverse of that process, Patanjali suggests, right? Through ethical, cultural, social obligations to personal, what's happening at the individual level, to then the physical body, what's happening in our physical body, to then what's happening in the energetic body, and so on. The removal or the erasing of the bounds of physical manifestation that we're abiding in the unmanifest. Does that make sense? Before I start just repeating myself.
Internal, external, movement, breath. Or asana.
So see here with the diagram, right? So we can say, just to simplify, we have our asana, we have the yamas and the niyamas, we have the pranayama, all physical. And then the second phase of the sutras is the withdrawing of the senses onto the unmanifest, which is essentially we are abiding back in that Purusha through the stages of the manas, the ahamkara, and the buddhi. Okay, so we're essentially, for lack of a better word, regressed back to the thing that allows manifestation to take place, for the individuation process to take place. So in essence, there are two operations within the individuation process, the manifestation and then the unmanifestation. And we can look at this, and I'm sorry if this is maybe a sensitive topic, but we can look at this throughout the trajectory of life, right? What happens literally in physical life? Sylvie, do you want to address that? What happens, right? We grow, age takes place, different stages of life, and then what starts to happen? There's, let's say, a metaphorical regression. Does that sound about right? Yeah. So the same thing is essentially happening with the sutras through the 8 limbs. Any questions about that?
Sort of like ego death as well, death of the ego in a way, or
No, you can think about it like that for sure. But again, it's a vocabulary that's Western in orientation. There is no ego death in yoga. There is no such thing as an ego in yoga. We might refer to that as the I function, that is contained in the manas, the mind, but that would be to simplify such a concept. When this is, for lack of a better word, very subtle in orientation. But you can think about it like that as a way of conceptualizing. But what I'm trying to suggest is that essentially we can flatten, condense the Purusha and the Prakriti to this apex level, this inverse level of where the physical body is located in space and time. We are essentially exercising both of these things as at the same time. So that's where I'm going to suggest it's not about trying to erase something or for something to be removed so something else can manifest. It's to suggest that everything is taking place at the same time through the senses and the 5 elements. Our task is to create a landscape where our focus is put onto one thing, all the while everything else is still happening. And that, by doing that, through the physical body, what we're allowing is for the vital force to emerge within the individuation process of which is already there. Celeste? Crystal? Am I making sense? So what yeah, I gotta stop. Talking too much. Question? Is this too much? What Robert just suggested with ego and this idea of conscious, subconscious, this idea of contextualizing what's happening, this is what's challenging about the sutras and within this lineage that we're learning from. We're not using that kind of conceptual apparatus and terminologies that can be associated to other forms of a psychological picturing.
we don't want to kill the ego, we want to observe it instead, observe the I, observe the individual.
Because the ego, if we want to use that term, because there's no ego in yoga.
Yeah.
If we want to use that term, we're suggesting that the ego has a super important function to allow us to exercise the first two limbs of yoga and the third, which is to take a seat. So this, any questions before I keep going? No, okay. So now I'm going to briefly contextualize this in relationship to the kosher model. We touched upon the kosher model this week. The kosher is not, it's not a system that's specific to the Yoga Sutras. It's an Ayurvedic concept. But it's interesting to utilize this layering of the body, 5 layers, in some systems 7 layers, specific to the physical body, okay? So we have this trajectory from the Annamaya, physical, Pranamaya, energy, Manomaya, mind, Vijnanamaya, we're getting into the more subtle esoteric components of the system, and Anandamaya, we can put that into the category of bliss, tranquility. You can interpret that however you want. But what we can start to suggest is if we have a body, the body is extended beyond the physical. Okay? So the layers, the Anandamaya, I'm suggesting, this most outward layer that surrounds the body, like our system of this inverted mirror of the Prakriti and the Purusha, is not only the most outward layer, but it's also imminent to the physical. So anything that's manifesting in the Anandamaya is also affecting or having effect on what's taking place in these more subtle terrains of the body. Question? Physical, subtle. We have a class about this. Physical to subtle, okay? Question? Crystal Celeste? I'll say it one more time. We have the physical body, Anandamaya. We have different layers that manifest outward of the body. The furthest most layer, which in the Ayurvedic model sits, like if you think of the chakras, which we briefly touch upon in the subtle body class, sits above the head. It's not literally in the head, it's above the head. And it's the same thing with the koshas. So that the Anandamaya and the Vijnanamaya are essentially outside of the body. But, like we have just established, this vital force that undergoes an individuation process that manifests into physical form Prakriti, I am suggesting, I'm taking liberties to do this, is also taking place in the kosher model, whereby the Anandamaya, sorry, the Annamaya and the Anandamaya are always having effect on each other, as with all of the other levels of physical through to subtle. When something is, let's say, like disturbed at one level, it affects the entirety of the body that extends outward of the physical. But remember, the body is like a mirror, which on an inverse is also contained in an immanent sense. Sylvia, you're going to say something, aren't you?
Well, and maybe we can talk about it in terms of like stress. If somebody's stressed out, because we have a lot of students and it's about that time of midterms. So when you are stressed out because you have midterms, too much to work and still keep up with everything else, where could this be manifesting and how is that relating to this beautiful diagram? Let's talk about it.
Yeah, stress is a good one, right? So do you want, let's use this example of stress. What's stress, Sylvie?
Stress.
Yeah, what? What's the stress response?
Stress, well, it's just how we perceive it, right? It's not what necessarily happens to us, it's what happens in our body.
So it's it's a literal physiological process of the central nervous system, right?
Cortisol, right?
That too.
But that physiological process at the anamaya level, the physical level, where does it have most of its repercussions if we're using the kosher model? And it can be multiple, right? So it's going to affect the energy, the pranayama, the pranamaya level, right? So literally your breath will change when you're under stress, when you're under the stress response.
The mind is up.
But what does stress mostly do, right? It affects our behaviors in many ways, which is the manomaya level. So we see here, just with one physiological process, this is a super good example, actually. This is from Dr. Grote. So we have here a physical process that affects directly the manomaya mind. And then let's take a step back. If this is the process, so we can see here a trajectory where these three things are intimately related in one physiological process. What does that have to do with this? And our goal of yoga of like stilling the vrittis and trying to naroda the mind. If we're under a stress response, some kind of one-pointed focus is going to be almost impossible. Yeah, okay. So we can see how this might affect as a methodology and individuation process that we're embarking upon our everyday life. So it's not to say that we start it and we keep going and we finish it, right? It's not like, that's not what Patanjali is suggesting. The sutras is something that we can live by every single day. And I think this example highlights that. We're under stress at different moments of the day, which affect us in different ways, but affect the body in different ways. What happens when we're under cumulative stress? This notion of the tranquil body, the anandamaya or the bliss body, is also going to start to be affected.
There's my mind as well. Okay.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So all of these, so we can start to can't probably see it. We can start to categorize these first three have literal physical connotations, where these last two have more subtle connotations related to our 8-limb system. First four are more physical, and then we start to withdraw the senses into the more subtle components of the practice. So you going to say something?
Oh, well, going back to what Robert was suggesting a little bit ago about cortisol.
Yeah.
So, more subtle changes that we might not see with our eyes are the cortisol levels rising, especially with chronic stress.
Yeah.
And with that comes a lot of fogging of the mind as well. So you're definitely getting up to the upper two there. And, yeah, and it's going back to how that relates to the funnel and how will you come to the middle of it or not.
Yeah. Also, what I'm suggesting for today is with the kosher system, and we take to consideration this cosmological duality of Purusha and Prakriti, And essentially the physical body being at the apex of how Purusha manifests through the physical body. Okay, here's the big like takeaway, like you get your pen out, you start like writing stuff down. Okay, we'll be waiting for it. So this is where we get to asana and this idea of a seat. Asana is mentioned once in the sutras in relationship to this idea of activity and ease, okay? How might this idea of activity and ease relate to this individuation process? I'm just gonna keep going, okay? And you can ask some questions after if you have any. Let's say that the manifest is an active process, whereby the unmanifest, the movement back up, it's just for picturing, is a passive, more subtle operation. And that's a very hard thing for us to come to terms with. I'm just thinking of myself right now. For a one-pointed focus of all the vrittis, how can that be a passive process rather than an active process? Activity in this sense means the creation of more things. It's a building outward. We're essentially, with the one-pointed focus that we're aiming for with our process of narodaing the mind, is to allow a sense of passivity to occur whereby our attention is drawn specifically onto one thing, and that one thing is not necessarily a physical object. It's a vital force that is part of the Purusha. So here's where this gets super interesting. We take a seat. We're distracted by a million different things. Some of them are going to be physical. Some of them are going to be energetic. Some of them are going to be manomaya. We're just going to stick with these ones. This is definitely happening, but that's too much. We might be irritated by a tight muscle. We had a surgery 10 years ago. Something happened to the pelvis. Maybe you have sciatica. Maybe you broke a rib. Whatever, maybe your breath is more oriented up into the thoracic body versus down in the abdomen, the lumbar spine. Whatever it might be, okay? To come to a place of passivity or one-pointed focus is essentially to override the activity that's manifesting through the individuation process. But when we, still with me? When we come to this idea of active, passive, subtle, physical, effort and ease, we have to then analyze individually, what are we predominant in terms of how we take the seat. Okay? So with the seat, we have to first observe what is our predominant disposition relative to this. And relative to this. Where are we spending most of our time? Like literally, okay? So this is where the physical body, the way that the body is literally taking up space, like literally how it's formed, is affecting each of these layers, and also this process, this passive process of the unmanifest. What happens here happens everywhere. And what happens here allows for communication between these two things that are operating on the same level through the physical body. Therefore, asana, a seat, I'm arguing is maybe the most important component of the sutras. Because the way that you place the body, the way that the body literally operates, affects everything else that's happening on a more subtle level. It's the thing that we have the most contact with, and therefore the most resources for understanding this process and this coming together of the Prakriti and the Purusha and the vital force that's undergoing the individuation process through manifestation as we reach this unmanifest phase, okay? Okay, so asana is super important. That's what I'm trying to say. It took me an hour. It took me an hour, but it was super fancy.
It's a way to gauge everything we've learned so far is when you're in the sauna, right?
So now we'll take it to another level. The way that my foot is placed, its behavior, the behavior of the foot is affecting what's happening in the mind and what's affecting these more tranquil and bliss states of the kosher body. Okay? Literally how I hold the body is allowing energy to flow freely between all 5, in some systems 7 phases of the kosher system, and for this vital force to be exercised in a way where active and passive are simultaneously operating. Anybody have questions? So we have time for like one pose.
I could just redo the breath again.
I just do one exercise. What's the time? We got, how much time we got? We got 20 minutes.
No, we don't. No,
We got 10 minutes.
We got 12 minutes.
We got 12 minutes. Crystal, I know you have a question. I can sense it.
Crystal or Celeste? I think you're looking at Celeste.
No, Crystal. I can
Crystal?
sense it through the
Oh.
black box.
Oh, from the. Okay, I'm looking at the chat. I don't see anything. Are we good, you guys, for now?
Yes, we're good. I don't have a question.
I'm just kidding. Just don't take me seriously.
Only when you're lecturing. Okay, all right. so
Okay,
you're about
is this helpful?
Very helpful.
So we want to add anything to this?
No, I don't.
So with that in mind, let's take Tadasana for a moment.
Okay, Martin Pop.
Yeah. So the first thing that we might do in Tadasana, we've talked about Tadasana in many contexts, but let's start with the feet. So everybody take a look down at the feet. Or before you do that, just notice where you stand. Notice where you stand, how you've placed the feet, where the arms are, what's the orientation of the pelvis. Do all of that, just notice, like we did when we were seated at the beginning. And if the eyes are closed, now open the eyes and look down at your feet. Notice where you've placed the feet. Are the feet wider than the pelvis? Are the feet too narrow? Are the feet turning in or are they turning out? Take the feet in a hip distance apart and place the center of the heel directly behind the second toe. We'll go a little bit closer together. There we go. Good. Notice if just with the reorientation of the feet, if that changes how you're standing.
Mhm.
Then
More balance.
you have more balance.
Mhm.
Feel the center of gravity.
Yeah. Then maybe take a micro bend into the knees. And notice how much bend you've taken. Too much or too little.
much.
So find a place where there's maybe a little micro bend, but without you moving in toward the backs of the knees, hyperextending. Good. Now from the micro bend, let the upper inner thigh bones move back. So that movement of the upper inner thigh bone going back is literally going to stick the pelvis out behind you. Good. Keep grounding down through the big toe mounds of the feet, the center of the heel. And from the back of the pelvis, let the sacrum move in and down, but maintain the movement of the inner thigh going back. With the inner thigh going back, the sacrum in and down. Now allow the back of the rib cage to lift away from the pelvis, the buttocks. As the back of the rib cage lifts and widens, let the sternum move in and up. Imagine that you're standing at the wall and then move the skull back in space. But notice if the chin has moved toward the throat or away from the throat. Allow the jawbone to sit parallel to the floor. Good. And then let the crown of the head float towards the ceiling. For some of us, without straining, maybe the gaze goes slightly up. And you can do that with the eyes closed. So notice that there are specific actions we've exercised, activities. Notice if the active points, big toe mound grounding down, inner heel lifting, outer heel grounding, softness to the back of the knee, upper inner thigh bone moving back, sacrum in and down, back of the ribs lifting, sternum moving in and up, jawbone parallel to the floor, back of the skull lifting. If all of that activity has created softness to the posture, to the seat. And then with the standing, come back to the even breath. Let the jaw soften, let the top of the tongue rest against the roof of the mouth, and just start to breathe evenly through the nostrils. With the breath, imagine that the inhale was opening up the back of the skull. Opening up the back of the skull. As if you could feel the breath moving into the back of the skull. Good, and then just keep doing that for a few moments. With the even breath. Even inhale, even exhale. And notice after you stand here for a certain period of time, if the energy, for lack of a better word, starts to move with a little bit more freedom and ease. Maybe you can imagine that the breath is moving up the front of the body and then down the back of the body. Inhaling up the front of the body, down the back of the body. Keep that loop going. Inhale the front, exhale the back. And simultaneously with the imagination, imagine the inhale moving up the right side of the spine, up the side of the face, and then down as you exhale the left side. Up the right, down the left. So essentially, we're creating with the Tadasana, the mountain pose, a sattvic quality of balance through two loops that are inhaling up the front, exhaling down the back, and inhaling up the right and exhaling down the left. Almost like a DNA strand. Take one more deep breath. Good. Exhale, open the mouth and open the eyes. Questions?